The year was 2287, and humanity had been traveling through space for almost 100 years now. But they still felt like children in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations who looked down on them with barely hidden contempt, and Alex Morrison knew this better than most as he stood on the bridge of the Valiant, watching the stars streak past in the viewing screen. And he was a lieutenant commander with 15 years of service under his belt, and he had seen enough of alien attitudes to know that Earth was not welcome in the wider galaxy, but orders were orders, and his mission today was simple enough to survey an uncharted star system in the outer territories and see if it held anything valuable for humanity's expanding colonies. Kate Sullivan sat at the pilot station with her hands moving across the controls with practiced ease, and she had been flying ships since she was 20, and now at 35, she could navigate through asteroid fields blindfolded if she had to, and beside her sat Danny Pierce, who was the chief engineer and a man who could fix anything with enough time and spare parts, and he was currently running diagnostics on the ship's faster-than-light drive while muttering about how the latest updates from Earth had made everything more complicated than it needed to be. The medical bay was quiet for now, and Lisa Crawford was using the time to reorganize her supplies because she believed in being prepared for anything, and she had served on 3 different ships before the Valiant, and she had seen enough accidents and emergencies to know that space was unforgiving and you never knew when disaster might strike. And meanwhile, in the security section, Greg Hamilton was training 2 new crew members in weapons protocols, because even on a survey mission, you needed to be ready for pirates or hostile aliens or any number of threats that lurked in the dark between stars. The Valiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the target system, and Alex leaned forward in his command chair as the sensors began feeding data to the main screen, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat because the system was rich with rare minerals and gases that were essential for building better, faster-than-light drives. And this was exactly the kind of discovery that could make Earth's expansion easier and cheaper and more sustainable for the future. Kate plotted a course toward the largest planet, while Danny confirmed that all systems were running smoothly, and the ship moved deeper into the system with its sensors sweeping everything in range and recording data that would be studied by scientists back on Earth for years to come. And Alex was already composing his report in his mind and thinking about how this discovery would be received by the admirals and politicians who controlled humanity's future in space. But then the alarm started blaring and Kate's hands flew across her controls as she identified multiple contacts appearing on sensors, and they were big ships much bigger than the Valiant, and they were moving to intercept with clear hostile intent. And Alex felt his stomach tighten because he recognized the energy signatures from the intelligence briefings he had studied. And these were Confederation vessels, and that meant trouble. The Confederation of Stellar Systems was the dominant power in this region of the galaxy, and they were an alliance of 7 alien species who had controlled the valuable star systems for over 3,000 years, and they did not like it when younger species tried to claim resources that the Confederation believed belonged to them by right of age and power. And Alex had heard stories from other captains who had encountered Confederation ships, and none of those stories ended well for the humans involved. The lead ship was massive and covered in weapon ports that could turn the Valiant into debris in seconds, and a communication signal came through, and Alex accepted it with a gesture, and the view screen filled with the image of a reptilian alien, whose scales were dark green and whose eyes were cold and calculating. And this was High Executor Tharnek of the Sarkathi species, and he was one of the Confederation's most powerful enforcers. Tharnek spoke in perfect English because the Confederation had been monitoring human transmissions for decades and learning everything they could about this young species who dared to venture into space, and his voice was deep and filled with contempt as he informed Alex that this system was under Confederation protection and that humanity had no right to be here, and that the Valiant should leave immediately or face the consequences of defying powers far greater than themselves. Alex kept his voice steady as he replied that according to the Galactic Charter, this system was unclaimed territory, and that Earth had every legal right to survey it and establish claims based on the laws that the Confederation itself had helped write centuries ago, and he knew he was taking a risk by challenging Tharnek. But he also knew that backing down now would mean abandoning any hope of Earth being treated as an equal in the galactic community. Tharnek's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward in whatever served as his command chair, and he explained with barely contained fury that the Galactic Charter was written for civilized species and not for barbaric primitives who had barely crawled out of their own star system, and that humanity's understanding of law and rights was irrelevant because they lacked the power to enforce their claims, and that the only thing that mattered in the galaxy was strength, and the Confederation had strength that humanity could not begin to imagine. The conversation was going nowhere, and Alex knew it, but he refused to simply turn around and run like a scared child, and he argued that Earth deserved respect and recognition, and that they would not be bullied into giving up legitimate claims just because older species thought they owned everything. And his crew watched in tense silence as their captain stood up to one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Tharnek had heard enough, and he gave a signal, and one of the Confederation ships fired a weapon that tore through space and struck the Valiant's shuttlecraft that was docked on the outer hull, and the explosion killed 3 crew members instantly. And Alex watched in horror as the names and faces of those people flashed through his mind, and they were engineers who had been performing routine maintenance, and now they were dead because he had dared to challenge the Confederation. Kate immediately put the ship into evasive maneuvers, while Danny tried to assess the damage and Greg scrambled his security team to check for hull breaches, and Lisa rushed to the area where the explosion had occurred, even though she knew there was no hope of finding survivors, and Alex felt rage building inside him. But he forced it down because right now his priority was getting his ship and his remaining crew to safety. Tharnek's voice came through the speakers again, and this time there was satisfaction in his tone as he informed Alex that this was a warning, and that next time, the Confederation would not be so merciful, and that humanity needed to learn its place in the galaxy before more people died for the arrogance of their leaders. And then the communication cut off, and the Confederation ships simply sat there waiting to see if the Valiant would try anything foolish. Alex gave the order to retreat, and Kate engaged the faster-than-light drive, and the Valiant fled the system while the crew mourned their dead and processed what had just happened. And they all knew that this was not over, because humanity could not simply accept being treated like insects that could be crushed whenever the powerful aliens felt annoyed. The journey back to Earth took 3 days, and Alex spent most of that time writing his report and talking to his crew, and thinking about the 3 people who had died for doing nothing more than their jobs, and he knew that their deaths had to mean something, and that Earth had to respond to this act of aggression or risk being pushed around forever. When the Valiant docked at Earth Station 1, Alex was immediately summoned to a meeting with Admiral Patricia Holland, who commanded the United Earth Defense Council, and she was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, who had fought in the resource wars on Earth before humanity had unified under a single government, and she listened to Alex's report with a grave expression that told him she understood exactly how serious this situation was. The council chambers were filled with politicians and military officers and diplomats, and they all had opinions about what should be done, and some argued for caution and negotiation, while others demanded immediate military action, and the debate went on for hours while Alex sat in a corner and watched and waited, and wondered if humanity would have the courage to stand up for itself, or if they would simply accept their role as second-class citizens in a galaxy that did not want them. Captain Jake Reynolds was there, and he was a decorated war hero who had saved colonies from pirate attacks and fought off hostile aliens on a dozen different worlds, and he stood up and spoke with passion about how humanity could not afford to show weakness and how every species in the galaxy was watching to see if Earth would defend its people and its rights, and his speech swayed many of the undecided members, and slowly the tide turned toward action rather than submission. 6 months had passed since the incident, and nothing had really changed except that now everyone on Earth knew what humanity was facing, and the tensions between human ships and Confederation vessels had grown worse with each passing week, and there were reports coming in almost daily of encounters in disputed space where alien ships would threaten human crews or force them to abandon their survey missions, and each time humanity backed down, it felt like another defeat and another confirmation that the galaxy saw them as nothing more than annoying insects. Commander Amy Foster had been given command of a new warship called the Defiant, and it was the most advanced vessel that Earth had ever built, with weapons and shields designed specifically to match what intelligence had learned about Confederation technology. And she walked through the corridors of her ship feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, because everyone was counting on this new class of warship to level the playing field and show the aliens that humanity could not be pushed around anymore without consequences. Her chief tactical officer was Lieutenant Ryan Clark, and he was a genius when it came to analyzing battle data and finding patterns that others missed, and he had spent the last 6 months studying every recorded encounter between human ships and Confederation vessels. And he had built computer models that predicted how the aliens would fight and where their weaknesses might be. And Amy trusted his insights because she had served with him on 2 previous ships, and she had seen how his tactical planning had saved lives more times than she could count. Meanwhile, far away on the Confederation capital world of Zenthari, the Council of 7 was meeting to discuss what they called the human problem, and most of the council members saw humanity as nothing more than a temporary nuisance that would either learn its place or be crushed into submission. And they talked about humans the way someone might talk about children who needed to be disciplined for their own good, and the arrogance in that chamber was thick enough to cut with a knife. But Ambassador Velnash of the Kailari species was different, and she had studied humanity more thoroughly than any other Confederation official, and she had read their history and watched their entertainment and analyzed their wars, and what she found disturbed her deeply because humans had a pattern of losing battles but winning wars through sheer stubbornness and adaptation, and she tried to warn the Council that underestimating humanity could be a fatal mistake, but her warnings fell on deaf ears because the other species had been dominant for so long that they could not imagine being challenged by primitives who had only been in space for a century. The Council decided that humanity needed to be taught a harsh lesson, and they would do this by establishing a blockade around 3 human colony worlds, and no supplies would be allowed in or out until Earth acknowledged Confederation supremacy and accepted its place as a minor species with no right to expand beyond the few systems they already controlled. And the vote was unanimous except for Velnash, who abstained and warned again that this action would only make humanity more determined to resist. The 3 colonies chosen for the blockade were New Terra, which had 50,000 people, and was the oldest human settlement outside the solar system, and Horizon Station, which was a mining colony with 30,000 workers, and Armstrong Colony, which was an agricultural world with 40,000 farmers and their families, and all 3 were vital to Earth's economy, and losing them would be a devastating blow to humanity's expansion into space. Captain Nicole Bennett commanded the Colony Defense Force at New Terra, and she had 6 small patrol ships and 2 aging frigates, and that was supposed to protect 50,000 civilians against whatever the Confederation decided to throw at them. And when the alien fleet arrived with 30 warships, she knew immediately that she had no chance in a direct fight, and all she could do was organize evacuation plans and hope that Earth would find a way to break the blockade before people started dying. War Master Crixthen of the Zarkal species commanded the Confederation blockade fleet, and his people were insectoids who lived in hive structures and valued order and obedience above all else, and he positioned his ships in a perfect geometric pattern around New Terra and sent a message to the colonists informing them that no ships would be allowed to leave or enter until Earth submitted to Confederation authority, and his tone made it clear that he expected compliance within days because surely these humans would not let their people starve for something as abstract as pride. Back on Earth, the government faced the hardest decision in human history, and they could submit to the blockade and save the colonies through negotiation, and accept that humanity would never be more than a servant species in the galaxy, or they could fight back and risk everything on the slim chance that their new ships and tactics would be enough to overcome the Confederation's superior numbers and technology, and public opinion was divided, with some people calling for peace at any price while others demanded that Earth stand firm no matter the cost. The families of colonists protested outside government buildings and demanded action, and mothers held pictures of their children who were trapped on New Terra, and fathers spoke on news programs about how they had sent their families to the colonies, believing they would be safe, and now they were being used as hostages by aliens who saw humanity as less than nothing, and the pressure on the government grew stronger with each passing day. Alex Morrison had been promoted to captain after his encounter with Tharnak, and he volunteered to lead a relief convoy to break the blockade, and his plan was risky and probably insane. But it was the best chance they had, and it involved using humanity's smaller, faster ships to slip through the blockade, while heavier warships engaged the Confederation fleet directly and drew their attention away from the supply vessels that carried food and medicine and everything else the colonists needed to survive. Admiral Holland listened to his plan, and she knew it would cost lives and ships, But she also knew that doing nothing would cost even more in the long run. Because if humanity allowed this blockade to succeed, then the Confederation would know they could push Earth around whenever they wanted, and there would be no limit to the demands and restrictions that would follow. And so she made her decision and gave the order to prepare the fleet for combat operations. The news that Earth was going to fight spread quickly, and some people celebrated while others mourned because they knew what war would mean, and the shipyards went into overdrive producing ammunition and spare parts and everything else the fleet would need, and volunteers lined up at recruiting stations wanting to be part of history, and the whole planet seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if humanity could actually win against an enemy that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. Amy Foster received her orders, and the Defiant would be part of the main attack force along with 15 other warships, and her crew prepared for battle with grim determination because they all knew that some of them would not be coming back. But they also knew that this fight was about more than just 3 colonies, and it was about whether humanity would have a future in the stars or be forever trapped in their own small corner of space, taking orders from aliens who despised them. Nicole Bennett on New Terra organized civilian volunteers to prepare for possible invasion, because even if the fleet broke the blockade, there was a chance the Confederation would land troops and try to take the colony by force. And among her volunteers were people like engineer Carl Stevens, who had built half the infrastructure on the planet, and Dr. Megan Torres, who ran the main hospital. And they were ordinary people who had come to the colony looking for a fresh start, and now they were preparing to defend their homes against an enemy that saw them as nothing more than animals. The fleet gathered at a staging point just outside the solar system, and it was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, with 20 warships and dozens of support vessels and fighter craft. And Alex stood on the bridge of his ship, looking at the other vessels on his screen and thinking about all the people who would die in the coming battle, and wondering if their sacrifice would be enough to earn humanity the respect they deserved. Ryan Clark worked with the other tactical officers to coordinate their attack plan, and they had run simulations hundreds of times trying to find the approach that would give them the best chance of success, and every simulation showed heavy casualties, but they also showed that it was possible to break through if they were willing to pay the price. And the final briefing was conducted over secure channels, with every captain receiving their specific assignments and fallback positions in case things went wrong. Kate Sullivan prepared her ship for combat, and she checked every system twice because in battle there was no room for mechanical failures. And Danny Pierce supervised the engineering crew as they reinforced critical systems and prepared damage control equipment, because ships would be hit and people would be hurt, and the only question was how bad it would get. And Lisa Crawford stockpiled medical supplies and converted cargo bays into emergency treatment areas, because she knew the medical bay would not be enough for the casualties they were about to take. The order came through and the fleet engaged their faster-than-light. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Terra system, and immediately the sensors lit up with contacts as the Confederation blockade detected their arrival, and War Master Crix. Then ships began moving into combat formations with the precision that came from thousands of years of military tradition and experience, and the aliens were confident because they had superior numbers and technology, and they had never lost a major battle against any species in recorded history. Amy Foster stood on the bridge of the Defiant and gave the order to advance, and her ship led the main attack force straight toward the center of the alien formation, while Alex Morrison's strike group veered off to the side, moving fast and staying low relative to the orbital plane, and trying to look like they were attempting a flanking maneuver, when really they were the ones carrying the supply containers that the colonists desperately needed. The first shots were fired by the Confederation, and their energy weapons reached across the empty space and slammed into human shields with enough force to light up the darkness, and Amy's ship shook from the impact. But the shields held, at least for now, and she ordered her weapons officer to return fire, and the Defiant's railguns spat out streams of metal at a fraction of the speed of light, and the projectiles tore into an alien cruiser's shields and began wearing them down. War Master Crix then watched the human attack with what passed for amusement among his species, and he had studied the intelligence reports about human military capabilities, and nothing he saw surprised him, and these ships were smaller and weaker than his own, and their tactics were straightforward and predictable, and he calculated that the battle would be over within 2 hours, and then Earth would have to admit defeat and accept whatever terms the Confederation chose to impose. But Ryan Clark had been studying alien tactics for months, and he had noticed something important about how Confederation ships fought, and they used targeting computers that prioritized threats based on size and firepower, which meant they always shot at the biggest ships first, and that created gaps in their defensive coverage that smaller vessels could exploit. And he had shared this information with every captain in the fleet, and now they were about to find out if his theory was correct. Alex sent out waves of single-pilot fighters that swarmed toward the alien formation, and the Confederation ships opened fire on them. But the fighters were small and fast, and most of the shots missed, and the ones that hit only destroyed one fighter at a time, while the larger human warships used the distraction to move closer and get better firing angles. And slowly the alien formation began to lose its perfect geometric precision. On the surface of New Terra, Nicole Bennett watched the battle through telescopes and sensors, and she could see the flashes of weapons fire in orbit, and each flash represented someone dying up there, and she did not know if those deaths were human or alien, but she knew that people were sacrificing themselves so that her colony could survive, and she organized her volunteers into teams that would be ready to unload the supply ships if they made it through. The cruiser Hawking took a direct hit to its reactor, and the explosion tore the ship apart and killed all 300 crew members in an instant, and Amy watched it happen on her screen and felt rage and grief mixing together, but she pushed those feelings down because she could not afford to be distracted right now, and she ordered her fleet to tighten formation and concentrate fire on the weakest points in the alien defense. War Master Crix then was beginning to realize that something was wrong, and the humans were not fighting the way he expected, and they were adapting their tactics in real time and using strategies that seemed almost desperate but were surprisingly effective. And when one of his frigates was destroyed by a coordinated strike from 3 human ships, he felt the first stirrings of concern, because no primitive species should be able to do this much damage. The space between the 2 fleets was filled with debris and bodies, and the wreckage of destroyed ships, and Amy maneuvered the Defiant through this chaos, while her crew worked frantically to keep the shields up and the weapons firing. And Danny Pierce was performing miracles in the engineering section, keeping systems running that should have failed already. And Lisa Crawford was treating wounded crew members in the medical bay and trying not to think about how many were not going to make it. Alex's strike group was getting closer to the planet, and they had lost 2 escort ships, but the supply vessels were still intact, and Kate was flying like she had never flown before, weaving through enemy fire and using the orbital mechanics to their advantage, and Greg Hamilton had his security teams ready to repel boarders in case any alien ships got close enough to try a boarding action. The turning point came when Amy realized that the Confederation ships were all networked together through a sophisticated communication system that allowed them to coordinate their movements and share targeting data. And if she could inject a virus into that network, it might cascade through the entire fleet and cause their systems to malfunction. And she called Brandon Walsh, who was her best computer specialist, and explained what she needed. Brandon worked faster than he had ever worked before, and he modified a communication drone with humanity's most advanced cyber warfare package, and it was designed to look like a normal distress beacon, so the alien ships would not shoot it down. Immediately, and Amy launched the drone during a feigned retreat that made it look like the human fleet was falling back, and the Confederation ships moved forward to press their advantage, and did not notice the small drone drifting among the debris. The drone attached itself to a Confederation cruiser's hull and began broadcasting what appeared to be emergency codes, and the cruiser's computer accepted the transmission because it was programmed to respond to distress signals from Allied vessels. And within seconds, the virus was inside the network and spreading like wildfire through every connected system, and suddenly targeting computers were showing false readings, and shield generators were cycling on and off randomly, and weapon systems were firing at coordinates where no enemy ships existed. War Master Crix then watched in horror as his perfect formation dissolved into chaos and ships were colliding with each other because their navigation systems were giving contradictory orders, and he tried to issue commands, but half his fleet could not receive them because their communication arrays were down, and he realized with growing dread that the humans had done something that should have been impossible and had turned the Confederation's own technology against them. Alex saw the alien formation collapse, and he knew this was their chance, and he pushed his ships forward at maximum speed, and the supply vessels broke through the weakened blockade and headed for New Terra's orbital docking stations and the escort. Ships engaged any Confederation vessel that tried to intercept, but most of the aliens were too busy dealing with their own malfunctions to mount an effective defense. The Defiant and the rest of the main attack force pressed their advantage and systematically destroyed or disabled the alien ships that were still capable of fighting. And Amy felt no pleasure in the destruction because she knew that the beings dying on those ships were just following orders like her own crew. But she also knew that this battle had to be won completely and decisively, or the Confederation would just come back with more ships and try again. Nicole Bennett watched as the human supply ships entered orbit and began their landing approach, and she gathered her volunteers at the spaceport, and when the first ship touched down, she saw the crew stumble out exhausted and wounded but alive, and they had brought food and medicine and hope, and the colonists cheered and cried and hugged each other because they had been saved. But the price had been terrible, and 12 human warships had been destroyed, including the Hawking and the Lincoln and the Discovery, and over 3,000 crew members were dead, and countless more were wounded, and every family on Earth would soon be receiving notifications about loved ones who had given their lives in the Battle of New Terra. And Amy looked at the casualty reports and felt the weight of command crushing down on her because these deaths were necessary. But that did not make them any easier to bear. The surviving Confederation ships retreated to regroup, and War Master Crix then sent a message to his superiors admitting that he had been defeated by a species he had dismissed as primitives, and the Council of Seven received his report in shocked silence because this was supposed to have been a simple police action, and instead it had become a military disaster that would force them to completely reevaluate their understanding of human capabilities and determination. Alex stood on the surface of New Terra and looked up at the stars, and he thought about the crew members he had lost and the ones who were wounded, and the families back on Earth who would never see their loved ones again. And he wondered if this victory was worth the cost, but then he saw the colonists going about their lives and children playing in the streets, and he knew that yes, it was worth it because humanity had proven that they would not be pushed around and that they would fight for their right to exist among the stars. Admiral Holland received the battle reports, and she immediately sent a message to the Confederation Council, offering a ceasefire and negotiations because Earth did not want a prolonged war. But they also 3 months after the Battle of New Terra, the negotiations began at Unity Point, which was a neutral space station that had been built centuries ago as a meeting place for different species to resolve their disputes without resorting to violence. And Earth sent Ambassador Christine Palmer to lead their delegation, and she was a career diplomat who had spent 20 years navigating the complicated politics of the solar system, and now she faced her greatest challenge yet. Christine brought military advisors with her, including Alex Morrison and Amy Foster, because she wanted people who understood what humanity had sacrificed to earn this seat at the negotiating table, and she also brought scientists and economists and legal experts because the negotiations would cover everything from territorial claims to trade agreements to technology sharing, and every detail mattered because the future of humanity in the galaxy depended on what was decided in those rooms. The Confederation sent representatives from all 7 species, and Ambassador Velnash led their delegation because she was the only one who had taken humanity seriously from the beginning, and she understood that these negotiations could not be approached with the usual arrogance and contempt that the Confederation showed to younger species, and the other ambassadors were angry about having to negotiate at all because in their view, military defeat should not grant humans the right to demand equal treatment. The first session was tense, and the Confederation offered what they considered a generous compromise, and humanity would be allowed to claim limited territories in the outer rim, far from the valuable core systems, and in exchange Earth would acknowledge Confederation authority over the galaxy's most important resources, and would agree to share all their technology and submit to oversight by Confederation inspectors who would make sure humans were not developing weapons that could threaten the established order. Christine listened to the proposal, and then she rejected it with calm finality, and she explained that humanity had not fought and died at New Terra just to become a client state with no real independence, and that Earth was seeking equal status, not permission to exist on terms dictated by others, and the Confederation ambassadors were shocked because they had expected gratitude for their generosity, and instead, they were facing defiance. High Executor Tharnak attended the negotiations, and he was still furious about the humiliation of losing to humans, and he argued that the Battle of New Terra was nothing more than luck, and that humanity had exploited a temporary weakness in Confederation systems, and that in a fair fight, the outcome would have been very different, and he suggested that maybe another demonstration of Confederation power was needed to teach Earth some humility. The tension in the room grew dangerous, and Christine could feel the negotiations teetering on the edge of collapse. And then Tharnek revealed what he considered to be the ultimate bargaining chip, and the Confederation had a weapon called the Dreadnought Eternal. And it was a massive warship the size of a small moon that had been built 1,000 years ago, and it had weapons that could destroy entire planets, and it had never been used in the current era, because just knowing it existed was enough to keep the peace. The holographic display showed images of the dreadnought, and it was terrifying in its scale and power, and the message was clear that if Earth continued to resist, then the Confederation had the ability to end humanity's expansion with a single strike, and some of the human advisors looked worried, because this changed everything, and how could they negotiate from a position of strength when the other side could annihilate them at any moment? But Christine did not show fear, and instead she made a request that surprised everyone, and she asked if the Confederation would be willing to examine Earth's history in detail, including humanity's darkest moments, and the wars and genocides, and the development of atomic weapons, and all the times that civilization had nearly destroyed itself. And she explained that understanding human nature was essential to understanding why threats would not work the way the Confederation expected. The alien delegates were curious despite themselves, and they spent days reviewing the historical records that Christine provided. And they watched footage from the World Wars, and learned about the atomic bombings, and studied the Cold War period, when humanity had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy their planet many times over, and they were horrified by the violence and the destruction, but also impressed by the fact that humanity had survived all of it, and had chosen to unify rather than destroy themselves. Christine's final argument came during a private session with the full council, and she spoke with quiet intensity about what it meant to be human, and she explained that humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars, and that every time civilization collapsed, they rebuilt, and every time they faced extinction, they adapted, and that threatening them would only make them more determined, because fear was not something that made humans submit. It was something that made them fight harder. She leaned forward and looked each alien representative in the eye, and she said that the Confederation could destroy Earth, but they could not break humanity, and that even if they killed every human in the solar system, there would be colonists scattered across dozens of worlds who would continue to resist, and that the cost of defeating humanity would be measured in decades of warfare and millions of casualties on both sides, and that by the time the Confederation won, their own civilizations would be so weakened that they would never recover. The room was silent when she finished, and Ambassador Velnash spoke up and said that she had tried to warn the Council about this, and that humans were fundamentally different from other species because they had been forged in violence and hardship, and that underestimating them had already cost the Confederation dearly, and would continue to cost them if they did not find a way to coexist as equals rather than as masters and servants. But before the negotiations could continue, a new crisis emerged, and the communication arrays lit up with distress signals from a Confederation mining outpost in the Gamma sector, and the reports were confused and panicked. But the basic message was clear that something was attacking the outpost and destroying everything in its path, and the defenders were being slaughtered, and they needed help immediately. The Confederation Military Command identified the attackers as a species called the Devourers, and they were creatures that consumed all organic matter in their path and left behind only dead, sterile worlds, and they had been thought extinct for over 500 years after the Confederation had fought a brutal campaign to eliminate them, and now it seemed they had returned from whatever dark corner of the galaxy they had been hiding in. The Council was thrown into chaos because the Devourers represented an existential threat to all sentient life in the galaxy, and they did not negotiate or take prisoners, and they could not be reasoned with, and the only way to stop them was through military force, and the problem was that the Confederation fleet was scattered across hundreds of systems and would take weeks to assemble a force large enough to face this threat. Christine saw an opportunity, and she made an offer that shocked everyone in the room, and she said that Earth would help fight the Devourers, but only as equals, not as subordinates, and that if the Confederation wanted human ships and human lives in this fight, Then they would have to recognize Earth as a full member of the galactic community, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. The debate that followed was fierce, and some council members argued that accepting such terms was humiliating, while others pointed out that they needed every ship they could get if they were going to stop the Devourers before they spread across the galaxy and consumed everything. And Ambassador Velnash broke the deadlock by pointing out that humanity had already proven their worth in battle and that pride should not be allowed to get in the way of survival. The vote was close, but finally the council agreed, and they would accept human assistance against the Devourers, and in exchange, they would grant Earth provisional membership in the Confederation, with full membership to be confirmed after the crisis was resolved, and Christine knew it was not everything she wanted, but it was enough for now, and it meant that humanity would be fighting alongside their former enemies instead of against them. Alex and Amy were pulled into emergency planning sessions with Confederation military commanders, and the cultural differences were stark and sometimes frustrating, but they found common ground in their shared understanding of tactics and strategy. And slowly they began to develop plans for how a combined fleet would operate, and how human and alien forces could support each other, despite using different technologies and different approaches to warfare. Back on Earth, Admiral Holland began mobilizing every available warship, and she knew this would leave the solar system vulnerable. But the threat was too great to ignore, and if the Devourers were not stopped, then eventually they would reach Earth. Anyway, and it would be better to fight them in Confederation space with allies than to face them alone when they finally arrived at humanity's doorstep. The crews prepared for deployment, and they were told they would be fighting alongside aliens who had been their enemies just months ago, and some found this difficult to accept while others saw it as an opportunity to prove once and for all that humanity deserved its place. The war against the Devourers lasted 2 brutal years, and during that time humanity and the Confederation learned to fight together despite their differences, and the combined fleet was commanded jointly by Admiral Patricia Holland from Earth and Fleet Commander Synthara, who was a member of the crystalline Heltani species, and together they coordinated attacks across dozens of star systems, trying to stop the Devourer advance before entire sectors were consumed. Alex Morrison commanded the human contingent aboard his ship, the Valiant, which had been upgraded with hybrid technology that combined human innovation with Confederation power systems, and his crew now included alien liaisons, including a young Sarkathi warrior named Kreshinar, who had initially resented serving with humans but gradually came to respect their courage, and a Kilari scientist called Mira Lin, who helped bridge the cultural gaps between species that had been enemies just months before. The Devourers were unlike any enemy the galaxy had faced, and they did not communicate or negotiate, and they showed no fear and no mercy, and each battle was a desperate struggle for survival, because if you lost, then your entire world would be consumed and turned into a lifeless husk, and the Alliance learned quickly that conventional tactics did not work against an enemy that valued nothing except feeding and growing and spreading. Amy Foster proved herself again and again in the fighting, and at the Battle of Cygnus Reach she commanded a small force of only 5 ships against a Devourer swarm that numbered in the hundreds, and she held a critical jump point for 18 hours, allowing civilian evacuation fleets to escape. And by the time reinforcements arrived, her ships were barely functional, and half her crew was dead. But she had saved over 200,000 lives, and even the Confederation officers who had doubted human capabilities had to acknowledge her skill and bravery. The combined fleet fought battles across the galaxy, and they won some and lost others, and the casualty lists grew longer with each engagement, and families on Earth and on Confederation worlds mourned their dead and wondered how long this war would continue and whether they would survive to see its end. And the psychological toll was enormous, because fighting the Devourers meant watching worlds die and knowing that every victory only delayed the inevitable unless they could find a way to stop the swarm permanently. The breakthrough came when Sarah Kim, who was a brilliant scientist working with a team of human and alien researchers, discovered a weakness in how the Devourers coordinated their attacks, and they used bioelectric pulses to communicate across vast distances. And if those pulses could be disrupted with specific electromagnetic frequencies, then the swarm would lose its coordination and become much easier to defeat, and the Alliance immediately began developing a weapon based on this discovery. The final battle was planned to take place at the Devourer home cluster, which was a region of space filled with the dead husks of worlds that had been consumed over centuries, and the combined fleet numbered over 200 ships from 8 different species including humans, and it was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. And everyone knew that this battle would determine whether sentient life would continue to exist in this part of the galaxy. The fleet jumped into the home cluster and immediately encountered resistance as thousands of devourer creatures poured out from the dead worlds and swarmed toward the allied ships, and the space around them filled with weapons fire and explosions, and the sounds of metal tearing and people screaming over the communication channels, and it was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension. The dreadnought Eternal entered the battle, and its reality-bending weapons tore through devourer formations like they were made of paper, and entire swarms were destroyed in single attacks. But even that massive ship could not be everywhere at once, and the Allied fleet was taking heavy casualties as the devourers pressed their attack from all directions with suicidal determination. Brandon Walsh, who was now the chief engineer of the entire fleet, came up with a desperate plan, and he suggested overloading their new electromagnetic weapon to create a cascading pulse that would disrupt all devourer coordination in the entire cluster at once, and the risk was enormous because any ship within the pulse radius would also be destroyed when the pulse went off, and that meant someone would have to deliver the device knowing they would not survive. Alex volunteered immediately, and his entire crew refused to abandon him, and together they piloted the Valiant toward the heart of the devourer swarm, and Kate Sullivan kept the ship flying, even as weapons fire tore through the hull, and Danny Pierce kept the engines running through impossible damage, and Lisa Crawford treated wounded crew members even as sections of the ship were exposed to hard vacuum, and Greg Hamilton led damage control teams into areas that should have killed them instantly. The Valiant was dying, and everyone on board knew it, but they pushed forward because this was what they had trained for, and this was why they had joined the fleet, and Alex activated the weapon as enemy fire finally overwhelmed their shields and tore into the reactor, and for one brief moment the pulse exploded outward at the speed of light, and every electronic system in the sector went dark. When power returned, the devourers were silent, and their coordination was shattered, and their swarm had dissolved into mindless fragments that could be hunted down and destroyed. And the battle was over, and the Alliance had won, but the Valiant was gone, and there were no survivors, and 7 names were added to the memorial walls on Earth and on Confederation worlds, and those names would be remembered for as long as their species existed. The galaxy mourned its dead, and every species had lost ships and heroes and loved ones, but they had also gained something precious, and they had learned that working together made them stronger, and that old prejudices and ancient grudges were luxuries that no one could afford when facing threats that endangered everyone, and the alliance that had been forged in desperation during the war became something more permanent in the peace that followed. 6 months after the final battle, a ceremony was held at Unity Point, and a monument was unveiled that bore the names of all who had died fighting the Devourers, and human names were carved next to alien ones with no distinction or hierarchy because death had made them all equal. And Christine Palmer stood before the monument with tears in her eyes, thinking about Alex and his crew and all the others who had given everything so that the rest could live. The Confederation Council formally recognized Earth as a full member with all rights and privileges, and humanity was granted territorial claims that would allow them to expand across dozens of systems, and Ambassador Velnash gave a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy, and she said that the Confederation had thought the stars belonged to them by right of age and wisdom, but humans had taught them that the stars belonged to those brave enough to defend them and wise enough to share them. Christine accepted the recognition with grace and dignity, but she also reminded everyone that the alliance had been forged in blood and maintained through sacrifice, and that peace required constant work and mutual respect, and that the moment any species began to think of itself as superior to others was the moment the alliance would begin to fall apart, and her words were applauded by representatives from every species present. Earth celebrated the news with parades and festivals, but also with memorial services for those who would never come home. And the joy was mixed with grief, because victory had not come cheaply, and every family had been touched by loss in some way, and the planet understood now what it truly meant to claim a place among the stars. A new human exploration ship called the Morrison was launched from Earth orbit, and its mission was to explore uncharted space beyond the galactic rim, and its crew was mixed with humans and aliens working together as partners rather than rivals. And as the ship jumped into hyperspace, it carried with it the hopes and dreams of all the species who had fought together and survived together. 20 years passed and humanity expanded to 50 star systems, and mixed colonies became common, and children grew up knowing both humans and aliens as neighbors and friends. And the wars seemed like ancient history to the younger generation, though. The veterans never forgot and made sure their stories were passed down, so that future generations would understand the price of freedom. Christine Palmer was old now, and she stood at the Morrison Memorial on Earth, where Alex and his crew were honored alongside all who had died in the wars, and a young girl who was half human and half Sarcathy approached her and asked what the wars had been like, and Christine knelt down and looked into the child's eyes, which reflected two species that had once been enemies. She told the girl that the wars had been terrible beyond words, but they had taught everyone something important, and the galaxy was dangerous, and survival required not just strength, but unity, and the girl's generation had inherited stars that were claimed in blood, and it was their responsibility to make sure those stars remained protected by bonds of friendship rather than threats of violence. The girl nodded solemnly and promised to remember, and Christine smiled because the future that had been bought with so much sacrifice looked bright, and humanity had proven that they belonged among the stars, not because they were the strongest or the oldest or the wisest, but